Okay, so I just want to introduce our first of 5 speakers. This is Pablo Bose. Pablo is an associate professor in geography here at UVM. He's also a fellow of the Gund Institute, and he works on a whole range of issues centering around environmentally induced forced migration, refugee resettlement, urbanization, mostly in the global south, climate change, and development. And a lot of that work bears really strongly on this theme. And so he's chosen a little bit of it to share with us today. Go ahead, Pablo, over to you.
Thanks very much, Taylor, and thanks to you and the Gund for organizing this important session. I'll just talk briefly, as you mentioned, about one aspect of the work that I do. As you mentioned, I'm an urban geographer and a migration studies scholar, and I've had the opportunity to partner with 2 other Gund fellows on a project that looks at refugee camps, environmental vulnerabilities, and public health crises. We've been fortunate to have some funding from the Gund to look specifically at refugee camps and COVID-19 outbreaks and responses to COVID-19 in refugee camps. Just to set the context very, very briefly, forced migration, forced displacement in the world right now is at kind of historic highs. In 2010, there was about 35 million people who were displaced in the world. And now these are people who are officially recognized as such, mainly displaced by conflict. Today, about 10 years later, there's about 80 million people who are displaced. That doesn't count people who've been displaced by climate change or environmental conditions. But what we set about looking at in this particular project, I'm going to share my screen really quickly here, was to look at a particular aspect of this. And that was to kind of look at the way in which some of these vulnerabilities are overlapping. We knew, as I said, you have this growing population of forced displaced in other parts of the world. And you have an infrastructure of refugee camps that are, simply put, inadequate for dealing with that sort of growth in population, not only just in terms of the sheer numbers, but in terms of the kind of populations you're talking about. Much of our global refugee system is really built around this post-World War II idea of refugees being in exile, eventually being able to return home, and being where they are in primarily kind of rural camps of 2,000, 5,000, 10,000, maybe even 25, 30,000 people, but for a short period of time. What we're finding now is that, and you can see on the screen here, this is just a number of the camps worldwide. In this project, we're looking at the 25 largest camps. And when we talk about that in terms of numbers, its magnitudes, larger than in the past. The 3 largest camps we looked at, Zaatari in Jordan, at its height had nearly 200,000 people, now about a little over 100,000. Dadaab in Kenya has around 200,000 people. And Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh, the largest refugee camp in the world, has over 900,000 people in it. In all of these places, as I said, it's not just about the number of people, but it's about these other kinds of vulnerabilities. We're finding that in these places where people are spending not a few months, a few years, even a decade, but in some cases generations, what it means to have this non-temporary camp raises all sorts of issues around access to resources, to healthcare, to all kinds of education, all kinds of goods. But in addition to this, what sorts of kind of other vulnerabilities are exposed? So we're looking in the case of Cox's Bazar, in the case of some of these other camps in Uganda and Kenya, for example, at some of the other kinds of vulnerabilities that people are presented with. So looking at things like flooding, looking at things like earthquake risks, the availability of health facilities, this again in Dadaab and Bidi in the context of Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh. We had these conversations with camp directors. I remember last summer where they were not only trying to get ready for COVID-19 and what this might look like if there was an outbreak in the camp, but you also had a cyclone spinning up in the Bay of Bengal. You had concerns about cholera outbreaks. You had concerns about monsoon rains, flooding, and mudslides, and things like this. So as part of the work that we've been doing, we've been trying to bring together existing data into an easier to use dashboard. Think about the kinds of data visualization we've seen become so popular during the pandemic. The John Hopkins dashboard, or even on a local scale here, what we see in Vermont. So we've been looking a lot at some of the different kinds of data that's out there. How would we bring some of these together? Cox's Bazar is one of the few refugee camps in which you see some level of coordination to try and estimate these sorts of risks. And not only to think about how we address the short-term issues here, but we've also had some really productive conversations with the UNHCR, International Organization for Migration, for thinking about how we plan for refugee camps in the future. So this is in part to try and build those models and those kinds of tools for people involved in the managing of these camps, but also very much for thinking about how better to involve the populations of the camps themselves. So how do we involve local people? Again, Cox's Bazar is one of the few that we've seen a little bit more evidence of this, of more engagement with some of the Rohingya and others who are in the camps, whether as sort of reporters of what's going on the ground, as first responders, training as first responders. So we're very much in the midst of this work. As I said, we've had some really interesting conversations with a number of partners, both at international organizations, but also within some of the camps themselves. Right now, our work is sort of moving towards testing some of those dashboards, seeing what kinds of data are available, what kind of work we would have to do to actually update that, given limited resources that both the camps and we have, and kind of how this fits into the broader thinking about forced migration and addressing a lot of the vulnerabilities that we see the people who are sort of caught in this dynamic facing. So I'm just gonna stop sharing there. Taylor, I think I'm in under 8 minutes. So I will pause there.
Yeah, you were. Nice job. So a reminder to everyone that we're going to have a little bit of Q&A at the end of each talk, and then a broader kind of back and forth and discussion involving all the panelists at the end. So there's one question I'll read off while people are thinking of what other ones are. Pablo, great talk. I wonder why there are so many camps in East Africa.
Yeah, there's two really quick answers to that. One has to do with the willingness of the particular host nations to actually host the camps. And it also has to do with a series of different kinds of it has to do with a bunch of the different kinds of conflicts that have been ongoing, especially in the Lake Victoria region. A really pretty devastating set of conflicts that have been ongoing for some time. Do you want me to answer Ellie Perkins' question, the climate refugee question? Yeah, that's a great question. It is a big debate. It is a debate that came up really in the late 90s, early 2000s, the idea of the environmental refugee and the climate, not so much the climate, but really the environmental refugee. And at that time, there was some pushback around that, and it fell away a little bit. It's really been revived. I've actually given a couple of presentations to the UNHCR specifically about this question. There's a practical response that would say we barely address conflict refugees, or the refugees that are produced by persecution and conflict right now. How does the world address an even greater number of refugees? I don't think that's a particularly good answer, because these are often overlapping and interlocking kinds of push factors that are pushing people out. And I think that it's something that we will need to continue to address as we move on from this. I actually just wrote a paper with a colleague on the concept of environmental displacement. And I used the Rohingya example, and I said that absolutely there's ethnic cleansing that happened. But if you look at Rakhine State, from which the Rohingya were violently dispossessed, there's an interlocking set of things that happened. There was heavy flooding in 2010 and 2015. There was a hurricane that hit. There was also an opening up of Rakhine province to export-oriented agriculture. There was a kind of a neoliberal privatization of certain areas geared towards, again, coastal development. So there's all of these things that are going on. It's not just one thing or another. And therefore, I do think that the climate or environmental refugee label is going to have to be something that we kind of come to terms with.
Okay, that's great. We'll leave a couple more questions for Pablo for the end. And let's move on now to Rochelle Gould.